He thought it was just a normal freezing workday until his dog led him to a lone metal structure hidden in the winter woods. It looked abandoned at first, yet it was a forgotten observatory quietly erased from every local record. And beneath it, he discovered things that had been hidden away for years. Stay with me. This story is about finding hope again, even when life feels cold. Before we begin, please help me reach my first 1,000 subscribers and let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Your support truly means the world to us. Winter in the northern United States arrived early that year, burying the forests under relentless snow and turning the wind into something sharp enough to feel alive. John Miller was 46, tall and lean in a way that came from years of physical labor rather than careful fitness. His shoulders were squared but slightly slumped, as if they still carried weight long after it had been set down. His hair, once a solid brown, had grown longer than regulation length, naturally messy, threaded with early gray. A short, uneven beard framed a face carved with hard angles, cheekbones sharp, jaw tight, features that rarely softened. He was a former U.S. Marine, and the war had followed him home. PTSD clung to him most fiercely at night. When snow fell, the wind scraped against the walls of his small rented cabin, and the sound dragged him back into memories of incoming artillery, of nights when the sky screamed and there was nowhere to hide. Sleep became impossible. His heart raced, his hands trembled, and his body braced for explosions that never came. During the day, John worked. He took whatever jobs kept him outside: repairs, hauling, line work, anything that exhausted his muscles enough to dull his thoughts. Pain, he had learned, was quieter than memory. Max was the only creature who understood this rhythm. The German Shepherd was 7 years old, large and broad-chested, with black and white fur that stood out starkly against the snow. His amber eyes were alert but calm, carrying an intelligence shaped by loyalty rather than obedience. Max had been with John for years, through moves, layoffs, and long silent evenings. The dog stayed close without crowding, watched without staring, and seemed to know when John needed distance and when he needed grounding. When nightmares ripped John awake, it was Max's steady presence, his weight pressed against John's legs, his slow breathing, that anchored him back to the present. Max was not trained for therapy, but he had become it. That morning, the temperature dropped well below freezing. John was assigned to inspect and repair a damaged power line deep in the forest, where ice had pulled cables down overnight. He dressed without ceremony: heavy boots, layered flannel, a worn jacket whose creases had molded to his body over years of use. His movements were efficient, practiced, almost ritualistic. Work gave him structure. It told him where to be and what to fix, and it asked nothing about who he had been before. As he drove toward the forest, snow drifted across the road in pale waves, and the sky hung low and colorless. Max rode silently in the passenger seat, ears flicking at distant sounds, his gaze fixed forward. The forest swallowed sound. Trees stood tall and bare, their branches etched black against the white sky. Snow muffled John's footsteps as he walked along the maintenance path, tools slung over his shoulder. He focused on the practical details, the tension of the cable, the condition of the insulators, keeping his mind anchored in the present. Time blurred the way it often did when his hands were busy. It wasn't until Max stopped abruptly that John noticed the shift. The dog's body tensed, his head turning slightly to the side, ears pricked. Then, without barking or pulling hard, Max gently tugged the leash and stepped off the narrow trail. "Hey," John muttered, instinctively tightening his grip. But Max didn't resist. He moved with quiet insistence, guiding rather than dragging. After a few steps, John saw it. Rising from the snow ahead was a curved metal structure, dull and weathered, standing alone among the trees. It didn't belong to the forest. No road led to it. No sign marked its presence. Snow had piled against its base, and yet it remained unmistakably deliberate, engineered, placed, forgotten. John stopped. His chest tightened, not with panic, but with a familiar unease, the feeling that came when something refused to fit where it should. He scanned the area automatically, old habits surfacing without conscious thought. Nothing moved, no sound but wind through branches. The light was already thinning, the afternoon slipping toward dusk faster than he had expected. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't going anywhere. John knelt briefly, brushed snow from a nearby rock to mark the spot in his memory, then straightened. "We're done for today," he said quietly, more to himself than to Max. The dog looked once more at the structure, then followed without hesitation. As they turned back toward the trail, the forest closed in behind them, swallowing the metal curve from sight. John did not investigate. He only memorized the location and walked away, the growing darkness urging him onward. A few days passed, but sleep did not return. Each night, as snow tapped against the windows of John Miller's cabin and the wind pressed its weight into the walls, the image of the curved metal structure rose again in his mind. It was not fear that brought it back, but something closer to irritation, a sense of disorder, of a thing left unresolved. John had learned, both in the Marines and afterward, that unfinished shapes were dangerous. They lingered. They demanded attention. On the fourth morning, after another sleepless night, he packed his truck before sunrise and drove back toward the forest, Max watching him from the passenger seat with quiet understanding. Daylight changed the place. The trees stood farther apart than he remembered, and the snow reflected a pale, almost blinding white that flattened distance and depth. John moved more slowly this time, deliberately. He did not let Max lead. When the structure came into view, it revealed itself in pieces rather than all at once. The curved roofline half buried in snow, the dull sheen of metal panels scarred by decades of weather, bolts exposed and dark with age. From this distance, the shape made sense. John recognized it not from books, but from old memory. Training bases, remote installations, places built for watching rather than living. An observatory. Not modern, not active, but unmistakable in design. The dome had been reinforced, its frame thick and industrial, meant to endure wind and cold rather than comfort. John approached only far enough to confirm what his instincts already knew. A weathered plaque hung crookedly near one side entrance, its lettering faded almost beyond legibility. Inside, visible through a cracked window, were shelves and a long metal desk. Several notebooks lay scattered where they had fallen, their pages curled and yellowed at the edges. He did not open them. He did not step fully inside. The space felt wrong, not threatening, but enclosed in a way that tightened his chest. The cold there was different, sharper, held in place by walls that did not breathe like the forest outside. His pulse began to quicken, not from danger, but from memory, the pressure of being contained, the echo of narrow rooms and locked doors. Max stayed close, standing at John's knee, his body angled outward, as if guarding both the man and the entrance. The dog's posture was calm, but alert, his ears rotating with each distant sound. John rested a gloved hand briefly against Max's neck, grounding himself in the warmth and solidity of another living thing. It helped, but only slightly. The edges of his vision felt too sharp, every sound arriving a fraction too loud. This was how it always started, subtle, manageable, and then, suddenly, not. John knew better than to test the boundary. He had learned, over years of missteps, that endurance was not strength when it came to PTSD. Knowing when to leave was. He stepped back into the open air and drew a slow breath, letting the wind cut through the tension in his chest. As he circled the structure once from a distance, one detail continued to bother him. An observatory of this size, even an old one, should have left a paper trail. County permits, utility records, something. John had spent enough time doing maintenance work for rural municipalities to know how slowly buildings disappeared from official memory. They were archived, not erased. Yet, when he later checked local records at the small-town library, a squat building staffed by a single elderly clerk who barely looked up as he passed, there was nothing. No mention, no listing. It was as if the observatory had never existed. That absence stayed with him more than the structure itself. By the time John returned to his cabin, the daylight was already thinning again. He fed Max, cleaned his tools, and sat in silence as evening settled in. He told himself he was finished with it, that curiosity was not a reason to dig into places meant to be forgotten. But as night fell and sleep once again refused to come, John knew the truth. He had confirmed what the thing in the forest was. He had not answered why it was there or why it had been so thoroughly erased. And until he did, it would not leave him alone. The next day, John returned with a clearer head and a different intention. The air was colder, the sky heavier, but his mind felt steadier than it had the day before. He parked farther away this time and approached on foot, letting the forest swallow the sound of his steps. Max moved beside him without a leash, his large frame controlled and quiet, black and white fur blending into the broken shadows of tree trunks and snowbanks. At 7 years old, Max no longer carried the restless energy of a younger dog. His movements were economical, purposeful, shaped by years of watching John, rather than being directed by him. John did not head straight for the observatory. Instead, he slowed his pace and widened his attention, scanning the land the way he once had in places where mistakes had cost lives. The signs revealed themselves gradually once he stopped rushing. Near a stand of pines not far from the structure, the snow had been disturbed in a way wind could not explain. John crouched and brushed away a thin crust of ice. Beneath it were boot prints, adult-sized, unevenly spaced, the tread pattern still sharp at the edges. Not old, not softened by time. Nearby, deeper impressions cut through the snowpack where rubber tires had pressed down, leaving parallel tracks that curved toward the observatory before disappearing beneath a drift. John followed them with his eyes, not his feet. Whoever had been here knew how to approach without leaving obvious paths, but winter had betrayed them. Snow recorded everything if you knew how to read it. He stayed where he was, letting the realization settle. This was not abandonment. It was use. Someone had been coming and going recently, deliberately, and in weather harsh enough to discourage curiosity. John felt the familiar tightening in his chest, not panic this time, but alertness. His body remembered this posture, stillness without relaxation, focus without haste. He shifted his weight slightly, finding cover behind a fallen tree, and let the minutes stretch. Max mirrored the change immediately, lowering his body and angling his head toward the observatory, ears flicking at distant sounds that never quite resolved into anything concrete. From where he watched, the structure looked different than it had before. Not newer, not active, but less dead. Snow clung unevenly to its sides, disturbed in places that suggested recent contact. John did not move closer. He did not need to. The evidence around him was enough to redraw the situation entirely. In his years after the Marines, working maintenance jobs across remote counties, he had learned that places people claimed were empty rarely were. They were simply ignored until something went wrong. The difference here was intention. Someone had chosen this place. Someone had kept it off the books. John stayed longer than he meant to. The light shifted, clouds thickened, and the cold seeped steadily upward through his boots. He welcomed the discomfort. It kept him anchored. He marked distances in his mind, noted sight lines, counted how many approaches the terrain allowed. These habits came back easily, too easily, and he did not question them. They were part of him, for better or worse. Max remained silent throughout, his presence steady and watchful, a living boundary between John and the instinct to move too fast. Eventually, John eased back the way he had come, careful to leave nothing behind that could announce his interest. As he retreated into the trees, one thought settled with quiet certainty. Whatever was happening at the observatory was not an accident, and it was not old. It was ongoing, and now that he had seen the signs, pretending otherwise would be a lie he could not maintain. John stayed longer than he should have, telling himself it was patience when it was really refusal to retreat. The forest dimmed as clouds thickened, and the temperature slid lower, tightening the snow until it creaked faintly under pressure. He moved when the light dipped, circling closer in short, careful advances, choosing ground that broke his outline and swallowed sound. Max remained behind, tucked into a shallow hollow where fallen branches and drifted snow masked his shape. The dog understood without being told, amber eyes fixed and steady. John approached the observatory's side entrance, the one half sheltered by a bent service awning. The door was heavier than it looked, steel-skinned, its hinges whispering despite his effort. Inside, the air felt stale and metallic, the smell of old oil and cold dust. He kept to the edge, boots landing softly, hands brushing walls for balance. Years ago, narrow rooms had taught him how to move without haste, how to let silence become cover. He went deeper than planned because nothing stopped him at first. Corridors branched, some blocked by snow that had blown in through damaged seams, others cleared just enough to pass. A generator casing sat under a tarp, not running, but recently touched. Scratches fresh, tarp folded with intention. John noted it and kept going. The mistake wasn't curiosity, it was time. He lost track of it the way he always did when his focus narrowed to a point. The observatory was not empty. It was managed. That realization came a second too late, announced not by sound, but by absence. The sudden sense that the building had noticed him. A man stepped into view at the far end of the corridor, close enough that John saw details before thought caught up. The guard was in his 30s, tall but thick through the shoulders, wearing a dark insulated jacket and knit cap pulled low. A trimmed beard cut a hard line along his jaw, and his eyes were pale and alert, the kind that never quite relaxed. He moved with the confidence of someone used to being obeyed, one hand lifting instinctively toward his chest as if reaching for a radio or weapon John couldn't yet see. The guard froze, surprise flickering across his face before settling into calculation. John did not wait to learn which would win. He turned and ran, choosing routes he had marked in his head, counting turns by feel as the building seemed to close around him. Voices rose behind him, short commands, sharp and practiced. A light flared, sweeping walls and corners, turning shadows into traps. John ducked through a maintenance hatch and slid down a short ladder, boots skidding as he hit packed snow. Cold air slammed into his lungs. He cut left, then right, then plunged through a break in the trees he had memorized earlier, trusting terrain over speed. Branches clawed at his jacket, ice cracked underfoot, and somewhere behind him a shout followed by the thud of boots echoed and faded. Max was already moving when John burst into the clearing, the dog exploding from cover in a silent sprint that matched John's angle without crossing his path. They ran until the forest thickened and sound died, until John's legs burned and his chest hurt in a way that anchored him to now. He slowed only when he reached the shallow ravine he had marked earlier, dropping down and pressing himself into the earth while Max stood guard, body angled outward, breath steady. They waited. Minutes stretched. No pursuit followed. When John finally rose, the failure settled heavy and undeniable. He had crossed a line without knowing the ground on the other side. He hadn't learned who they were or how many, only that they were organized, alert, and prepared to defend the place. As he retreated deeper into the forest, the observatory disappeared again behind trees and snow, but it felt closer than ever, no longer a question, now a threat. The first mistake was not going in. It was believing he could leave without consequences. John did not return to the observatory out of courage, but out of preparation. 2 days passed after his retreat, days spent measuring risk instead of feeding curiosity. He studied maps, checked weather windows, and adjusted his routine so nothing marked him as someone circling back. His movements were quieter now, tighter, stripped of impulse. When he returned, he did so before dawn, the forest locked in a gray stillness that muted sound and softened distance. Max stayed close, older now but no less precise, his black and white coat dusted with frost, his amber eyes tracking every shift in the trees. This time, John did not enter where he had before. He moved along the slope behind the structure, where wind had carved snow away from the rock, revealing a service hatch half buried and overlooked. The descent was narrow and steep, metal steps bolted into stone, the air growing colder and heavier with each level. The lower space was not abandoned, it was controlled. Cables ran along the walls in neat bundles. Instruments hummed softly, not loudly enough to carry upward, but alive. John slowed, counting breaths, feeling the pressure build behind his eyes in the way it always did underground. He pushed through it. The room opened into a wider chamber where lights glowed dim and constant, their warmth carefully rationed. That was when he saw them. Robert Hayes sat at a metal workstation, his back slightly hunched, shoulders narrow beneath a thick sweater worn thin at the elbows. He was in his early 70s, tall once, now stooped, with a long face carved by fatigue rather than age. His hair, white and fine, clung stubbornly to his scalp, and wire-frame glasses perched low on his nose as his hands moved with steady precision across a control panel. Years of discipline showed in him, not physical, but mental, the posture of someone who had spent a lifetime thinking through problems rather than fighting them. Eleanor Hayes stood nearby, smaller and sharper in presence despite her frailty. She was a woman in her late 60s, slender, with silver hair pulled into a tight knot at the nape of her neck. Her eyes were alert, assessing, and when they met John's, they widened not with fear, but with calculation. Survival had honed her into something hard-edged and watchful. They did not speak at first. Eleanor's gaze flicked past John toward the corridor, measuring time. Robert's hands paused, then continued, muscle memory refusing interruption. When Eleanor finally spoke, her voice was low and controlled, as if sound itself carried risk. They had been missing for years, she said, declared lost after a research grant collapsed, and the observatory vanished from official records. They were never meant to be found again. The men who came later had known exactly what they were looking for: old satellite arrays, dormant receivers, systems capable of pulling data without drawing attention. Robert and Eleanor had been given a choice that was not a choice: work or disappear entirely. So they worked. They rationed food, conserved power, kept the equipment alive, and waited. John listened without interrupting. He felt the familiar burn of anger rise, sharp and immediate, but he kept it contained. This was not a moment for noise. Max moved closer to Eleanor, sensing the tremor in her hands she tried to hide. She reached down without thinking and rested her fingers briefly against the dog's neck, grounding herself the way John often did. It was a small human gesture, and it told John everything he needed to know. These were not collaborators. They were prisoners who had outlasted their captors by refusing to break. Footsteps echoed faintly somewhere above. Eleanor stiffened. Robert shut down a sequence with practiced speed. There would be time for explanations later, Eleanor said. There would be consequences for John simply being here. But for the first time in years, the possibility of something other than endurance existed. John nodded once. He had come back for answers. What he found instead were people who had not been allowed to die, and who were still waiting for a way out. The storm arrived faster than the forecast had promised, swallowing the forest in white noise and turning distance into guesswork. Snow came sideways, driven by wind that howled through the trees and hammered the observatory like thrown gravel. John felt the change before he saw it, the pressure drop, the way sound flattened and time seemed to compress. Below ground, the lights flickered once, then steadied. Eleanor Hayes stiffened at the console, her narrow shoulders tightening beneath her wool sweater. Robert stopped typing, his long fingers hovering, listening with the patience of a man who had learned to hear danger through walls. They did not need confirmation. The men always came back when the weather was worst. Storms erased tracks and buried mistakes. Footsteps rang overhead, heavier than before, careless with urgency. Voices followed, short, irritated bursts shaped by cold and routine rather than fear. John moved automatically, positioning himself between the corridor and the hazes. His body remembered this geometry even as his mind resisted it. The underground air felt too close, the ceiling pressing down until the edges of his vision sharpened. PTSD surged hard and sudden, dragging old sounds into the present. Metal screaming, orders shouted, the concussive thud of impact. His breathing went shallow. For a moment, the years collapsed into one another, and he was no longer a man in a frozen observatory, but something braced for annihilation. Max broke the spiral. The German shepherd pressed against John's leg, solid and warm, a living weight that anchored him. John dropped to one knee and wrapped his hand into the thick fur at Max's neck, forcing himself to count breaths. In, out, again. The moment passed, but it left a tremor behind. Above them, a hatch slammed open. Light speared down the stairwell, followed by the first of the men. The leader was the same guard John had seen before, mid-30s, broad through the chest, beard trimmed close, eyes pale and efficient. Behind him came two others, both younger, both moving with the restless aggression of men who believed numbers made them safe. One was lean, sharp-faced, with a crooked nose that suggested past violence. The other was heavier, jaw slack with cold, his parka unzipped as if he resented the weather itself. They carried themselves like contractors, not soldiers, used to control, not resistance. Max lunged before John could stop him. The dog took the brunt of a swinging baton meant for John's head, yelping as it glanced off his shoulder. Rage flared hot and clean, cutting through the fog. John surged forward, driving into the narrow space, using the walls to limit angles and numbers. He didn't fight to win, he fought to delay. Eleanor shouted over the chaos, her voice sharp with command, directing Robert to shut down systems in a precise sequence. This was not panic. It was practice. The storm above intensified, wind screaming through broken seams. Snow forced its way down the stairwell in gusts. One of the younger men slipped, crashing into the railing with a curse. John seized the moment, slamming the emergency panel Eleanor had pointed out earlier. The old distress transmitter coughed, then whined, then locked into a steady pulse. A signal meant for isolation, once used to summon help when the world went quiet, shot upward through the storm. Sirens cut through the wind minutes later, distant but unmistakable. The men froze, calculation flashing across their faces. The leader swore under his breath, backing toward the stairs. There was no clean exit now. Snow and lights flooded the clearing as law enforcement vehicles broke through the trees, engines roaring, red and blue, reflecting off the whiteout. Orders followed. Weapons clattered to the floor. The fight drained out of the room, leaving only breath and aftermath. When it was over, John sank against the wall, shaking with delayed reaction. Max limped to him, shoulder already swelling but eyes bright, tail thumping once in reassurance. Eleanor knelt beside the dog, her thin hand steady as she examined the injury. Robert watched the officers secure the men, his face unreadable until the cuffs clicked closed. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but beneath the observatory, something finally broke free. Winter had taken its price. It had not taken them. Spring did not arrive all at once. It came cautiously, in longer days and thinner ice, in the slow retreat of snow from the observatory's metal skin. The men who had taken the place were gone, their footprints erased by storms and time, but the structure itself remained, scarred, stubborn, and intact. Repairs began quietly. Crews came and went, careful not to turn the site into a spectacle. Eleanor Hayes supervised with sharp efficiency, her slender frame wrapped in layers, silver hair now worn loose and practical. Robert moved more slowly, but with purpose, his long fingers steady as he recalibrated instruments that had once kept him alive. They spoke little about what had been done to them. Survival had taught them which memories were useful and which were not. John took the job no one else wanted. Caretaker, maintenance, grounds. The words meant routine, and routine meant something he could hold. He fixed doors, cleared drifts, replaced wiring, and learned the language of the place the way he learned forests, by paying attention. His body still startled at loud sounds. His nights were still fractured by dreams he could not fully outrun. PTSD did not loosen its grip simply because danger had passed, but the work gave him a reason to wake before dawn and a place to stand when the noise inside his head grew too loud. He slept closer to the observatory now, in a small converted room that smelled of oil and cold metal, and he slept better for it. Max healed quickly. The bruise on his shoulder faded from angry purple to yellow, then disappeared beneath thick black and white fur. At 7, he moved with the confidence of a dog who had done his job and expected nothing in return. He followed John through the grounds, alert but relaxed, greeting visitors with a calm presence that made even nervous hands reach out to touch him. Children came first, local school groups curious about the stars and the strange old dome in the woods. Max accepted their attention with patient dignity, tail sweeping slow arcs through the air. The observatory reopened without ceremony. It became a place for small lectures, community nights, and quiet research. Nothing ambitious, nothing secret. Eleanor spoke to students about the discipline of observation, about how the sky rewarded patience more than brilliance. Robert taught from a stool now, conserving strength, his voice steady as he explained the mathematics that made wonder measurable. They did not frame their survival as heroism. They framed it as endurance. People listened. One night, after the last visitors had gone and the grounds lay silent under fresh snow, John climbed the narrow stairs to the upper platform. The wind had softened, and the sky stretched wide and clear above them. Stars cut clean paths through the darkness, unblinking and indifferent. Eleanor joined him, her breath visible in the cold, followed by Robert, who leaned lightly on the railing. Max settled at John's feet, his body a familiar weight, warm and real. For a long moment, no one spoke. John felt the old ache press in, the sense that peace was temporary, that vigilance was safer than hope, but the stars did not flicker or fall. They held their places. He thought of the nights when sleep would not come, when the wind had sounded like incoming fire, and he realized something had shifted. The memories were still there. They always would be. But they no longer stood between him and the present. Eleanor broke the silence, pointing out a constellation newly visible in the winter sky. Robert smiled faintly, correcting her angle with a practiced hand. John watched them, watched Max breathe, and felt the rarest thing settle into his chest. Not happiness, not relief, but steadiness. The observatory had been erased once, hidden and abused. Now it stood open, imperfect, and honest. The stars above had witnessed everything that happened beneath them, and they were still there. So were they. Sometimes the miracle is not thunder or fire, but endurance quietly rewarded. God works through patience, through hands that refuse to let go, through nights that still end in morning. If this story touched you, please share it, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. May God bless you, protect your loved ones, and bring light into your everyday life.